Let's say on this Wolfowitz article now. This
Yeah, go for
one
it.
in the Wall Street Journal titled "The Forever War Hasn't Ended," and he starts off this article, Will, by saying that basically the United States is making a mistake by ending the forever wars because as the attack by ISIS-K shows that the enemy gets a say in ending those wars and we can't end the war because they're still attacking us, which is absolutely absurd because the war against the Islamic State Khorasan group was never ending, and the Biden administration has said it like 4 or 5 times in the days leading up to the attack on the Kabul airport. They were talking about how ISIS-K was a threat, how they're going to maintain the over-horizon capability, all
Yeah.
this kind of stuff. They're directly saying that they're not going to end the war against ISIS-K. And so that's the really first misleading thing that I found in this article. Another thing that he brings up later in the article, but I think it ties in well here, is there's a lot of conflation with the Taliban and ISIS-K, and people also conflating the idea with the United States signing a deal with the Taliban to the Taliban signing a deal with the Afghan government. And people say
Right.
that this proved that you cannot trust the Taliban, but I think it shows just the opposite. The Taliban have not actually violated the Dawa agreement. As far as it goes throughout this whole thing. Now, I think there was things in there saying that they weren't going to take major cities, but they didn't start doing that till after the U.S. broke the agreement by staying. And so
Right.
when you look at where the violations were of the agreement, I think this actually had this whole thing, if anything to me, Will, has shown that the United States can actually successfully work with the Taliban. As far as the evacuation from the Kabul airport goes, as far as they're not being shots fired between the U.S. and the Taliban for all this time. No Taliban killing American soldiers for the past 18 months. That goes to show that, the U.S. can work with the Taliban. Now, Hawks want you to believe the exact opposite is true, but if you just look at the reality of what's been unfolding, I think that's a complete lie. Wolfowitz, like Kagan, invokes a lot of the post 9/11 fear and saying Americans have forgotten that, and that's a lot of what he chalks the problems up to. He says that the Taliban enabled the attack on American soil, which I think is a pretty debatable point. Will, we could start. I don't want to get into all these nitpicky things because, again, like you just gotta read Fool's Errand to know it all, and I don't want to spend another half hour here breaking all these things down. But the Taliban did offer to give up Osama bin Laden. Tried to signal to the Americans that they could take him before 9/11 happened. Certainly offered to give him up after. But they really do try to leave out that narrative in this whole thing.
Yeah, something with this whole safe haven myth that they often cite as if Afghanistan is uniquely, specially designed for terrorist planning or something. But the 9/11 attacks were planned from all over the world. They were planned in Hamburg, Germany. They were planned in cities in Florida. There's nothing special about Afghanistan that allows a terrorist presence to plan something. It's just a ridiculous idea. And if anything, it's extremely far away from anything important of any, Western city or Western target. Afghanistan is like exile.
Right. One of the things he says in here, Will, is that Biden says ISIS-K and Taliban are rivals, but they may work together against the common enemy in the United States. And he says this, without mentioning that the U.S. that the way that this triangle has gone of enemies is actually the U.S. working with the Taliban against ISIS-K, not the
Right.
other way around. And to completely leave out that history is extremely misleading and dishonest. He says that Americans only supported the withdrawal because they didn't realize the other option was the rise of enabling terrorist groups and terrorist safe haven in Afghanistan. Which is completely absurd. That's not even the foregone conclusion, and that's just what he's making. It's also, I don't think, really fair for him to just come right out and say that. Now, he has a prescription in here, Will, for I think 4 things that Biden should do. He says, one, he needs to tell Americans that the war on terror will be really long. He says 4,000 Americans died, 400,000 American military personnel died in the 4 years of the of World War II. And so, we should expect that this could be very long, like, 75 years or so. And that, long wars aren't the worst kind of things. Now, what he's really talking about here, Will, is something that Matt Boot has laid out far more grotesquely, which is basically that they want Americans to fight forever wars in these countries to try to build little American states. And the way they're going to do this is essentially through genocide, where they're going to continue to kill in those countries anybody who opposes the American way of life until whoever is left will complies. And Matt Boot has directly compared this to what the Americans did in the American, I guess, Indian Native American wars, right?
Right.
So, this kind of disturbing thing. And, I do think that these people are enough of sociopathic, genocidal monsters to actually think that's what needs to be done here. So, that's one of the things he points at, one of the things he calls for Biden to do. He says it was a mistake to trust the Taliban and for Biden to ignore the Taliban aggression, and that the U.S. should have carried out more airstrikes. I'm not sure what we could do about that now. He says that third, choosing to avoid forever wars by abandoning our Afghan allies was both costly and dishonorable. This is the old war hawk trope that we heard after the U.S. tried to pull out of Syria under Trump. We're abandoning our allies, Will. Oh no, it's so terrible. And that's kind of where they go to. Of course, he rolls out another famous hawkish trope calling Biden Neville Chamberlain. So I don't know why exactly hawks are allowed to make references to the Holocaust and to World War II without being called anti-Semitic, but I think we should just go for it and say that was a anti-Semitic thing and he should be canceled for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he goes again in this one section in these 3 paragraphs. Well, he maybe hits on the 3 biggest Warhawk tropes. The other ones, we didn't learn the lesson from the Iraq withdrawal because we're withdrawing from Afghanistan now. And hell, this one is even worse because look, they took over the country far faster than the Islamic State rose in Iraq. Yep. He says that it was wrong for Biden to say that the U.S. bore the brunt of this fight. And in this point, I actually think he's kind of making a decent point that gets left out, although he's not really, saying it for the reasons that he should be saying it. That when we talk about the Americans who have died in this war, I think 4,000 to 6,000 if you include contractors, that's absolutely tragic. But 66,000 Afghans have, died fighting for the American cause here too, Will. And I have to imagine that there's a lot of people among those ranks who, because the Americans came into the country and, basically were over half of the economy, it was the Americans or heroin to make money in Afghanistan, that a lot of young men didn't have any choice but to join the ANA. And then the U.S. shipped them to Helmand, a place that was, as foreign to them as a lot of, Afghanistan was to Americans. And then, they end up getting killed there. And so, Biden saying that this was all in the U.S. military is unfair in that way. However, for his part, he says that Biden is exaggerating the cost sustained and that really we could lose about 20 men a year and that's okay. And so, of course, I don't think he's volunteering to be one of those 20 men or for his kids or anybody in his family to be, but he's okay with, 20 Americans dying every year. Now, this is all kinds of misleading, Will, because he says, look, we could keep 3,500 troops in Afghanistan. It would be no problem. Of course, he fails to mention that's only because Trump has signed that deal. And there'll probably be a hell of a lot more than the 13 dead Americans so far in 2021 in Afghanistan have Biden just broke the deal. Now, he also has 3 actions for Biden to take. He says the first and most urgent is to attend to the safety of Americans, and he wants to do this by making a bunch of threats to the Taliban, which, unless the Taliban are doing something towards the Americans, you shouldn't start threatening them because, hell, maybe the Taliban will just, do it because you're telling them to do something that they know they can do. But I kind of doubt that'll happen, but it's just an absurd point to make and just some grandstanding that he's doing. Second, second, he says we need to threaten China, which is almost even more absurd, Will, because this is a case where China does border Afghanistan, will probably have more influence in Afghanistan moving forward. And if the U.S. is concerned about Afghan nationals or American civilians, China may be a partner that we could work with to get those people out of Afghanistan. And yet you have the U.S. doing things like sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait, and and Paul Wolfowitz is saying we should be aggressive against China, when I think the exact opposite should happen. And then the third thing is he says we need to give more aid and comfort to our allies in our Gulf Arab allies, which is absolutely hilarious, because a big reason that he says we need to stay in Afghanistan is for the Afghan people. Of course, Saudi Arabia, I'm sure one of the states he's talking about we need to give more support to, is just as brutal to their civilians as the Taliban will probably be. The last thing he says, just like Hagen, very disturbing, Will, is basically saying Americans are going to experience another 9/11 now that we're leaving. So that's why I had on that article out. If you have anything to add, go for it.
I'm sure that last part about a new 9/11 will drive the conspiracy kooks crazy. These are the same people who talked about with their under the Project for a New American Century, we need a new Pearl Harbor to galvanize a new, So I'm sure that little line at the end will drive the conspiratoids nuts. All right. No, man, you did a great job summarizing those columns. Those are some of the top worst neocon warhawks architects of the war on terror. And yeah, you did a great job tearing them down.